Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second part of our webinar entitled The Longevity Code. I hope you enjoyed the first part. We had many clicks, which was great, so I feel that my message was well received, and we also got very good feedback, many thumbs up, so thank you very much indeed for this. I think today it's going to be at least as interesting because we will be talking about many other codes. I prefer the term code because it goes back to the verb to code, which I prefer to hacking, a term generally associated with computers. Today I will be talking about the physical level, and I will first talk about nutrition, food, intermittent fasting, the Wim Hof method. On the emotional level, I'll be talking about stress, physiology, the different types of stress, and the way we can avoid stress. So we won't be talking about stress management, which I think is a useless concept. We don't want to manage stress, we want to avoid stress. We don't even want to let it in. So I really think it's a stupid concept, as is work-life balance, because the term work-life balance implies that work is something which is different from life, which is not true at all. We know that the two are inseparable. And we also know that at the end of the day, there will be many success stories at work, perhaps even more than in our leisure time. The flow researcher Csikszentmihalyi showed this very nicely. Then we will be talking about effectiveness, which is particularly important during the corona crisis and is there to stay. We will be looking at two simple but very effective principles. One is the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. We will also look at the Parkinson principle, which has got nothing to do with Parkinson's disease. We are just going to look at how we can work efficiently, effectively, and swiftly. I found another interesting study to do with biological age. Here's the study that produced these results. This was a study carried out in a home for the elderly, and it was established that elderly people who were only able to walk at just under 3 kilometers an hour as a maximum speed, they were highly likely to die within the next 10 years. If you add 0.1 meter per second in terms of speed, you can reduce the risk by 12%. And as of 6 kilometers per hour walking speed, the risk to die within the next 10 years was almost zero. So that's another interesting approach to establishing biological age, perhaps for you to motivate yourself to exercise as much as you possibly can. Nature simply conceived human beings in such a way that we need to move 10 to 15 kilometers every day in order to stay healthy. It's something we can also do while doing something else. Yesterday I had to spend 5 hours on the telephone. While I had my phone calls, I walked around Lake Constance. I did 10 to 15 kilometers, and I was able to combine business with pleasure in a very natural way. I call this net time because I simply don't waste any time, because I can make my phone calls while I work out, while I exercise, and I can also add kilometers or steps to my tracker, my tachometer. Let's now take a look at the physical level again as a very basic concept. We've already talked about sleep in part 1 of the longevity code. Today I'll be focusing on the way we eat. It is absolutely obvious that if we limit the amount of food we take, we can limit the burden on our organism, because 80% of energy is needed to digest the food we eat. And if we reduce the amount of food, we can save energy. So red deer, for example, during mating season, or salmons about to spawn and jumping up waterfalls to get back to their breeding ground, these animals fast because they simply have more energy available to go back to the source or to perform during the mating season. During stress, we immediately stop the digestive organs in order not to waste any energy. If you like to eat a lot, I recommend you eat less per meal in order to live longer, to eat more in the long run. And this is what I call a balanced diet of scarcity. So the diet needs to be balanced. It should contain everything we need, but it should be limited. It should be scarce in quantity. Brucker, who is the nutritional guru, he wrote a large number of books on the different foods we consume, milk, food, meat, water, what have you. And at the end of his books, he usually provides a summary, which is basically all you need to read. There's no point in reading the whole book, because at the end of the book, he says, don't eat any products that are being advertised or that have come out of a factory, which I think is a very good rule of thumb. We can also quote Hippocrates. He lived before Christ, and he said at the time, just imagine how old this is, he said thousands will have eaten themselves to death before one person dies of starvation. He also said your food should be your remedy and your remedy should be your food. So what he basically says is, if we feed ourselves properly, if we eat or could eat healthy food, we need or would need no supplements. The problem is that as a result of soil exhaustion, our soil no longer contains what it used to contain. Our ancestors grew a crop on one field in 1 year and then let it recover in the second year while growing a crop on the second field. Today, our fields are used to produce 3 or 4 crops per year, which completely exhausts the soil. So it's obvious that in vegetables, in fruit, in potatoes, in apples, we no longer have the nutrients that we used to have in ancient times, which definitely has an impact on us and which is something we can all easily understand. Basically, food should be no source of stress for our body. It should be no burden, no strain on our body. It shouldn't trigger adrenaline or cortisol. Insulin goes up if we add short-chain carbohydrates to our food. Cortisol goes up in case of stress. The two are called the diabolic twins. And obviously, we don't want to have any toxic substances in the food we eat. We don't want to have anything that could trigger allergies, for example, heavy metals. Which is why we also need to make sure that in our diet, we know what we eat. What we want is as many nutrients as possible, as many dietary fibers as possible, and we want to start early on in the food chain. The food we consume should be unprocessed at the stage where the food has not been touched, has not been tampered with. We always think we have a huge choice in a supermarket, but most products sold in a wrapping or in a packaging basically are made of wheat, milk and sugar. It's all the same, even though it might look different. It's just a different rearrangement, a different mix of the same product. So the McVitie's chocolate digestives, for example, are not much different from Oreo cookies as far as the basic ingredients are concerned. So we don't really have a good choice. We just keep eating the same thing over and over again, even though they may look different on the shelf. Let's now look at gluten for a moment, because gluten is important. It has a very special position in our diet. Gluten is a very stable protein which is completely indigestible for the human body and acts as an antigen and triggers the formation of antibodies. It can also trigger allergies, for example, the gluten sensitivity, or even a disease, the celiac disease. It inhibits digestive enzymes which break up proteins and carbohydrates. That's what they should be doing. Gluten is basically conceived by nature as a defensive mechanism to fight off plant predators. There are also poisonous berries, for example, rowan berries. The berries protect themselves against their predators by producing toxins, and wheat protects itself against plant predators by producing indigestible gluten. Let's now take a look at what gluten does. Basically, we have a substance called zonulin, which disconnects the tight junctions between gut cells. So zonulin opens up these tight junctions, which means that pathogens and proteins can get into these junctions. Gluten also causes these zonulins to be released in large quantities. So many of these tight junctions become leaky, which gives rise to the term leaky gut, basically a permeable intestine which can let pass large quantities of pathogens and proteins because they can now get through this natural barrier, which is our intestine. Then gluten also directly binds to gut cells, which can trigger inflammations in the gut tissue. When gluten is decomposed, parts of it can bind to opium receptors, which is why we can become addicted to gluten and food containing gluten, which is unfavorable for the human body. A similar mechanism can be observed with milk. Milk also binds to the opium receptors. In the past 100 years, in cereal breeding, the gluten content was increased because it also is basically like an adhesive. Just think of any bakery goods. You know that they disintegrate very easily. But what is a problem is that we have two convergent axes. Cereal breeding increased the gluten content in our food, but also the way we work our doughs in baking is different. In the past, we used to work with sourdough, which was left to rest for days. And bakers no longer have the time. They don't want to invest that much time, which is why you can hardly buy any sourdough products anymore. And gluten will no longer decompose in a natural way as a result of fermentation. Let's take a look at the different diets available today. We have the fully carnivore diet, basically an organism just feeding on animal protein and water. Eating animal product has made the human brain evolve in anthropological terms. But we also have to take a different angle. Take a look at the way these animals live. Animals which feed exclusively on meat. Take a look at the big cats in the zoo. They live for only 15 years maximum. These big cats, these big predators, hardly move. You have to be lucky in the zoo to see a lion or a tiger walk around. Most of the time they rest, they sleep. And we also need to bear in mind that they don't eat every day. They just eat meat maybe once a week. They fill their stomach and that's it. And it has to be it for the next few days. The advantage is that these animal proteins display a complete profile of amino acids. But obviously, the further down my prey is in the food chain, we add up all the different toxins or heavy metals, toxins such as glyphosate, for example. And then there's the Paleolithic diet, which basically represents the way humans in the Stone Age fed themselves. Now, the cavemen had sensational preconditions. At the time, it was actually warmer than it is today. It was before the last ice age. And if they didn't die as a result of tribal battles or killed by a saber-toothed tiger, they had excellent preconditions to survive. Still, they only lived until 30. Paleolithic diet actually means that we eat anything we can get our fingers on. For example, meat, eggs, insects, herbs, grasses, leaves, fruit. Anything we can find. Then there's the ketogenic diet, which tries to avoid carbohydrates. It focuses on meat and poultry, but also on healthy fats and healthy oils, low carb, no carb, but also vegetables and fruit. It reduces the level of glucose in our blood, which is basically good, but it cannot really live up to intermittent fasting as a diet. And then there's vegetarians. Take a look at the zoo again. There are hardly any pure vegetarians, because with every vegetable we eat, with every plant we eat, we also eat some insects. There's no way around it. Even if it's just green flies, there will always be a little bit of animal protein. No exceptions there. But if you look at the animal kingdom, you can see that monkeys or primates or elephants, they can grow up to 80 years. In the zoo, you can see that these animals do not rest. They are on the move almost all the time. They simply have more energy and live much longer. They don't eat any meat, no fish. And then there's the vegans not taking any animal products whatsoever. That's just an overview over the different diets. So let's now take a look at food of animal origin compared to vegetarian diet. I already mentioned this point earlier. There is a concept called biomagnification. It's basically an enlargement and intensification of toxin and heavy metals in our food chain. So the further down our food is in the food chain, the more dangerous it becomes. We also need to look at karma for a moment. Think of intensive animal farming or factory farming. While there may be some laudable exceptions, factory farming or anything we buy in terms of packaged meat comes with enormous suffering for the animals, caused by the way animals are kept, by the slaughtering methods. This all adds up to biomagnification. Let's not forget one fact. 80% of all drugs produced by the pharmaceutical industry are used for animal husbandry, for intensive animal farming. So we all get it back through the meat we consume. All these pharmaceutical products will eventually be absorbed by the human body through animal husbandry. Not directly, but indirectly. Take a look at our environment as well. With large-scale animal husbandry, we have deforested large surfaces of our planet. The Phoenicians were the first ones to deforest large areas of land for their boats, but we can see it in Brazil as well. In Brazil, they destroyed their landscape, first through gold digging, and secondly, as a result of cattle breeding, intensive animal farming, which comes with massive emissions of CO2 and methane. Take a look at the hunger problem worldwide. As part of the Swiss Biohealth News and the Swiss News programs, I showed that there were 1,000 times more casualties due to starvation in the first quarter of 2020 than due to COVID-19. And even if meat were healthier, which it is not, we should simply say no to meat for ethical reasons or for reasons to do with the hunger problem around the world, and also in an effort to save our planet. So we simply have to dispense with animal products as much as we can. There's no way around it. Take a look at this chart. In order to produce 1 kilogram of meat, we need 10 kilograms of cereals, and I think we all agree that 10 kilograms of cereal would feed us for much longer than 1 kilogram of meat. We also need up to 15,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of meat. Let me enlarge this chart. Take a look at the bottom line. Potatoes. We just need 133 liters of water, but for meat we need 16,726 liters of water. That's cow meat. So the further up our food is in this table, the worse for our environment. There's a huge controversy about vegetarianism, yes or no. You can believe whatever you like, but from an ethical standpoint, basically eating meat is a no-go, because we fuel the hunger around the world, or sustain the hunger problem, and also keep destroying our planet. And it doesn't have to be meat. There are intelligent solutions, intelligent alternatives. In addition to this, meat and animal products in general contain a high degree of saturated acids. They are not as healthy as unsaturated acid. We also know that there's an acidic pH value. We need to get into the basic area of pH value. An acidic pH value promotes inflammation. So we know in a pro-inflammatory state, it is much easier to suffer from this cytokine storm, which is also relevant for COVID-19, which is what patients die from with COVID-19. There is the China study, which looked at thousands and thousands of studies and clearly illustrated that cardiovascular diseases, killer number one of the world, is substantially increased. The typical taste of meat comes from our urine, basically, at the time of death, which is why in some religions animals are slaughtered according to Jewish rites. So basically blood is drained from the body of the animal before the animal actually dies, so that no blood and no uric acid is released into the meat. If you go to a kosher butcher, for example, and buy meat, that meat doesn't taste the way our meat does, because it doesn't contain uric acid. Uric acid isn't healthy for us. If you go to a butcher's and say, has the meat matured properly? Basically you're asking, has the meat started to rot? Because maturing in terms of meat means that you give time to the microbes to start their work. At the point of death of an animal, meat starts to be decomposed by microbes, and if we wait for a certain amount of time, the meat becomes more tender, softer, and this is precisely the natural decomposition process. So matured meat basically means it has already started to rot. So this is a question you can ask yourself if you eat meat on a regular basis. Is this really good for you? We also know that eating meat increases the risk of diabetes and produces more cell stress. As for fish, I would say it's definitely better than meat, but we've got to be very careful what kind of seafood we eat. Particularly shellfish is not good for you because it contains a high level of heavy metal. Don't get me wrong, I personally love shellfish, but I try to limit the consumption as much as possible. This is a rule of thumb. The bigger the fish is, the further down it is in the food chain. The big fish eat the small fish, and it's quite clear that an anchovy contains less in terms of heavy metals than a tuna, for example. At the same time, fresh water is better than salt water, and running water is better than standing water. The conclusion is that the best type of fish you can possibly eat is the river trout. And then we have another study from Loma Linda University. It's a very recent study, and it says very clearly that meat protein is unhealthy, while protein we get from nuts or seeds is very good for our heart. but meat protein increases the risk of suffering from cardiovascular diseases, and that is the killer number one worldwide. So it makes perfect sense to think twice and perhaps move away from eating meat. Let's also take a look at the question whether humans are really carnivores. It's a controversy which has been going on forever. Take a look at these different types of diet. We've got the carnivores, that's those eating meat. We've got the omnivores eating everything. We've got the herbivores eating plants. We've got the frugivores eating fruit. And then you can also see what the paws look like of the different animals in these categories. You can see that human hands look completely different. Human hands are not suitable to tear a rabbit apart and mangle it. Our hands are suitable for climbing trees or collecting food we find. Our instinct already tells us very clearly what we are. If you are in a room, you're about to starve, and you have a rabbit and an apple, what are you going to do? You will not get the rabbit, tear it apart and eat it. You will first eat the apple, perhaps also take the apple away so that the rabbit doesn't eat it, but you wouldn't, as a first step, kill the rabbit and eat it. Also, when we have an accident with deer, for example, and there's blood across the windscreen, it doesn't trigger our instinct as it perhaps would with our dog. We feel discomfort in such a moment, which is a very, very clear sign that we are not carnivores. Because without tools, without the butcher preparing the meat for us, we wouldn't actually go for the kill ourselves. None of us would easily kill a pig or a cow or a rabbit. Also, take a look at the teeth in the different categories. Human teeth, quite obviously, are very close to those of herbivores and frugivores. You can also take a look at the jaw and the way we eat, the movement our jawbone makes, and our eating behavior in general. We don't rip out large chunks of food. We slowly chew the food. We don't swallow big bits of our food, which is a clear argument in favor of us being frugivores or herbivores. The same is true for saliva. We've got very big salivary glands in order to pre-digest our food in our mouth. Carnivores don't have that. Their saliva is acidic. Our saliva is basic in order to decompose starch. Carnivores don't have basic saliva. They need acidic saliva to decompose proteins. And the same is true for sweat glands. So all the arguments are there that human beings are not carnivores. They are not omnivores. The same is true for our stomach, our urinary system. We've got hydrochloric acid and pepsins in our stomach, which is a clear indication that we are no carnivores. Also look at our intestine. If you eat intestine, it has to get out of the intestine fairly quickly. So the length of the intestine is fairly short with omnivores and carnivores. And pure herbivores, such as cows or cattle, have very, very long intestines, 20 times the body length. And with human beings, it's close to frugivores, 10 to 12 times the body length. And we also need dietary fibers that carnivores don't need in order to stimulate intestinal movement. Digestive time is very long. We digest for a period of 12 to 18 hours, whereas carnivores only digest for 2 to 4 hours. Also, if we look at cholesterols and vitamins, we cannot produce vitamins ourselves, which puts us directly into the group of frugivores, in the same group as primates or monkeys. They can't produce vitamin C themselves. Everyone else can produce vitamin C themselves. This is information I took from discovervegan.com, a website I warmly recommend to you. I think this basically says it all. It tables all the arguments. Human beings, judging against all the parameters, are not carnivores. Full stop. Now, of course, for our immune defense, we need proteins. We heard this from Professor Frohböse. Particularly in case of an infection, we need to generate 30 to 40% more in antibodies, and we need more proteins for this. So proteins are very important. 0.8 to 1.5 gram is the demand per kilogram of body weight. If we're 70 kilograms, we probably need about 100 grams of protein every day. And we should try and obtain this protein from as many vegetarian sources as possible. It's not a good idea to do what Steve Jobs did, to eat apples for a full year. It doesn't make no sense. It would be much more advisable to eat regional produce, fruit, berries, local stuff, and also complemented with fats, nuts, and seeds. We can also obtain protein from protein shakes, vegetarian protein shakes, of course, and there's also mixtures, amino acid mixtures available which contain a full profile of different amino acids. This is a website from Reformhaus which shows a list of different types of food and their protein content. If you look at the top line, seitan, if you eat 100 grams of seitan, you have already taken 75% of proteins. That's almost the daily portion you need for someone at 50 to 70 kilograms. But you can also look at the pulses there, Hülsenfrüchte, that's pulses. You would have to take about 300 grams to get the 75 grams. That's not impossible. You've just got to be original and find intelligent solutions to your diet. And you can get it without the downside, without toxins, without heavy metals, glyphosate, saturated fatty acids, etc. So what you need to do is to be intelligent in your approach, but the question is, what are we going to eat? In today's times, we shouldn't eat too much fruit because fruits have changed as a result of breeding and the exhaustion of our soils. Fruits today contain hardly any micronutrients nowadays. Our grandparents might have said, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. That's not true today any longer, because today we would have to eat about 100 apples to get the same amount of micronutrients than our ancestors had. Today, all that is left is fructose and water. It makes much more sense to eat as many berries as possible, because berries also bring down the insulin level, the glycemic index. So they have a low glycemic index, insulin index, and we always need to make sure that we don't boost our insulin level. So less fruit, but as many berries as possible. Whenever I talk about berries or vegetables, I always refer to the best possible quality, either from your own garden or from the farmer next door. If it's from a supermarket, always ensure top quality from a health food shop, etc. Don't try and save money on vegetables and berries. Try and eat as many vegetables as possible, because vegetables make our conditions basic. Particularly in the evening, you've got to be careful not to eat too much raw food, because our intestines often can't handle raw food. It's something you need to practice. You've got to take raw food on a regular basis in order for your intestine to be able to process it. Raw food is great, but in the evening I would recommend cooked or grilled vegetables, perhaps a minestrone, a vegetable soup rather than a carrot, because this would be stressful for our digestion and the digestive power is reduced at night. I mentioned it before, vegetable is basic, and in the morning it's important to immediately try and become basic, because we wake up in an acidic state. You can easily test that by buying a urine test strip from your pharmacy. It's not very expensive. And if we eat bread with Nutella or a chocolate spread, we become even more acidic. But in order to become fit, we've got to become basic as quickly as possible. Let's take a look at the basic vegetables: spinach, carrots, celeriac, dark leaves, rocket, French beans, cauliflower, Savoy cabbage, fresh peas, tomatoes, cucumbers, beetroot, white beans, and bananas. Bananas also contain magnesium, but don't eat the banana in the evening because it pushes our insulin level and we don't sleep very well. Try and eat banana either in the morning or at the latest at lunch. The advantage of vegetables is that it contains large quantities of water, similar to our human body. 80% of vegetables is usually water. If we eat vegetables, salad, lettuce on a regular basis, we don't really have to drink that much because the food itself already contains large quantities of water. And this is live water compared to water we may take from the tap, for example, or even from a bottle. We also have dietary fibers, which are very important. Herbivores and frugivores do just the same thing in order to stimulate bowel movement. And also to feed our bacteria in our intestines. It's quite obvious that even when you live close to a factory, you may have glyphosate or dioxins in homegrown vegetables, but 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times less compared to meat you buy from a supermarket. Packaged meat contains much higher quantities of unfavorable substances compared to homegrown food, vegetables, or any other foods from your own garden. We also get micronutrients for free. If we were to feed in a perfect manner, we wouldn't need any supplements whatsoever because we would also get a sufficient amount of proteins, particularly if we ensure diversity on our plate. We can obtain more proteins from nuts, not peanuts, by the way, because peanuts are no nuts. They also contain aflatoxin, so you've got to be very cautious there. But walnuts, macadamia, pecan nuts, seeds, make sure it's always seasonal and regional. Pulses and beans, these are all sources of high quantities of protein. We should try and avoid sugar wherever we can, short-chained carbohydrates in other words, and any products containing starch because it will simply boost our insulin level. Healthy fats as much as possible. Avocado contains a large amount of vitamin D3, which is definitely something that I can recommend you take in large quantities. Eat as many avocados as possible. Virgin coconut oil is highly recommendable as well. Try and avoid trans fatty acids wherever you can. So everything that has been deep fried, such as French fries, for example, that's not good for our body. It's rather the opposite. Here's a little summary. Nutrients is everything that is alive, and if you stick it into the ground, it will continue to grow. And that would happen with a carrot unless it's been treated not to grow. Everything else is just food stuff. It's just stuff. It's calories. For example, cookies. In the morning, we've got to make sure that we become basic as quickly as possible. So for breakfast, vegetables, salads, a smoothie, try and avoid anything which contains sugar. And it would be even better to actually apply a fasting cycle and extend the fasting cycle. Breakfast already says it all as a term, breaking the fasting process. We already do that at night for 8, 9 or 10 hours, and if we skip breakfast as well, we very easily reach the 16 hours, which I will come back to at a later stage. It is very clearly also a fake to say that the breakfast is the most important meal of the day. This concept was invented in 1907 by a company called Kellogg's. They were the inventors of our breakfast, and they used it for advertising purposes, obviously. Basically, everything that we do needs to make sense in nature. If I tell you, I'll throw an apple and it's going to fly away. You will laugh at me because you know, due to gravity, the apple will fall down to the ground again. So everything needs to be in line with nature, needs to follow the laws of nature, needs to be based on a natural process. So let's apply this principle to breakfast. And I'm sure you all agree that our ancestors 10 or 20 or 100,000 years ago, when they did have food, they consumed it immediately. They would certainly not have left anything overnight, because when they were asleep, they couldn't defend the food against family members, neighbors, predators, animals. Whether or not they finished everything or kept something for later, we don't know. If they left something, it would have been gone the next morning. They had no fridge to open and just take out muesli or yogurt, what have you. They just had nothing for breakfast. They first had to go hunting or collecting, gathering food. And if they were lucky, they might have found food for lunch. But perhaps also it took them one day or two before they would find something. And when they did find something, they finished it immediately. This is logical. This makes perfect sense. And this is a principle we need to apply as well. And it has very, very favorable effects, the 16-8 fasting cycle. Personally, I wouldn't consider myself a pure vegetarian. I'm a flexitarian, hobby vegetarian. If I'm invited to friends and they serve fish or meat, I'll eat it. But at home, we hardly ever cook fish or meat. But you don't have to go about it in a dogmatic way. It shouldn't be a religion, because everything we do in a dogmatic way simply just causes stress, and this will not be beneficial to our health at large. So I prefer to be flexible in terms of vegetarianism. It doesn't have to be a forced way of living. If it's a forced way of living, my mother is perfectly right. She said many, many years ago, when I was a dogmatic vegetarian, she said to me, you know, vegetarians don't live longer, they just look much older, because of the forced nature of their vegetarianism. We can easily show and prove that human beings who eat vegetarian look younger. Eating meat makes you grow older more quickly. There's no question about that. We should make sure that we limit the amount of gluten we consume. Let's try and avoid bread altogether. I personally don't eat any bread at all. We also need to ensure high quality fats, nuts and berries as much as possible. We need to try and limit the amount of short-chained carbohydrates, which includes sugar, but it also includes fructose. So fruit, but anything to do with white flour as well. We also need to make sure we hydrate properly, we drink enough water. If we want to feed in a perfect manner, we need to make sure we have as much vegetables and fruit. And in that case, you don't need that much water. If you drink water, make sure it's purified. I use a device called the Futamate, recommended to me by Dr. Mutter. This is a device which cleans and purifies the water, adds oxygen to the water, which will certainly have a positive impact on my body. Again, don't just believe what someone else tells you. Device X is better than device Y. Don't just believe it, try it out. Put out different bowls of water on your balcony and observe which bowl is preferred by the birds. You will see that they will not drink from the bowl with bottled water. They will prefer tap water. But if you add rainwater, they will prefer the rainwater. And if you put out a bowl with purified water, they will drink the purified water. Don't believe anything someone else says. Just try and produce the evidence yourself. Ask nature itself. It will give you the right answer. Let me now talk about intermittent fasting. Not eating for 16 hours and then eating within a corridor of 8 hours only. Some people also apply a 5-to-2 principle. 5 days of eating, 2 days of fasting. This doesn't really work for me because it makes me bad-tempered and aggressive. So for years I have been practicing 16 to 8 intermittent fasting, which is easy for me no matter how much I have to do. I also try and exercise early in the morning, and even if I have seminars, I usually don't eat before lunch. I just drink water on a regular basis, and it doesn't make me tired at all whatsoever. Hippocrates said, your food should be your remedy should be your food. But he also said, if you eat when you're ill, you're actually feeding the illness. And we know that from animals or children. When they are ill, they stop eating. So don't tell your child, come on, let's eat something because it will make you strong and healthy again. That's completely wrong. If you are ill, you stop eating because you don't want to add an additional burden on your system. Benjamin Franklin put it nicely. He said, the best of all medicine is resting and fasting. That's absolutely right. That's the best thing you can treat your body to. And it's ideal to do this in a preventive way, and we do just that by applying the principles that I mentioned in the first part of the longevity code. We've got to make sure that the quality of our sleep is as high as possible. We need to make sure a very long, deep sleep phase, and we need to do this every night, fasting and resting. That's precisely what we need to apply. 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of high quality rest. Here I have the link for a website with the 10 health benefits of intermittent fasting. Take a look at it and you will find the following statements. First of all, fasting reduces the insulin level and also reduces insulin resistance, thereby reducing the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It also helps burn fat, which causes weight loss. And if I combine it with endurance training, running, walking or hiking, we even burn fat while we sleep. So if you want to lose weight, apply the 16 to 8 intermittent fasting principle. Intermittent fasting also generates 5 times more human growth hormone. You develop more muscles. There is also autophagy and mitophagy. Old senescent cells will be digested, and these senescent cells represent a risk for degeneration and cancer. So it's important for these cells to be removed from the body. You can accelerate that by applying the principle of intermittent fasting. You won't need any senolytics to destroy those cells. But also mitophagy is very important. The mitochondria, the old powerhouses of the cell, will be removed from the body. New mitochondria will be generated, and then we have AMPK here. That's the adenosine monophosphate protein kinase. We'll see this later. Again, the production of AMPK is generated, stimulated when mitochondria are removed. Then we also have adenosine monophosphate, which is basically the reduced form of ATP. ATP is the powerhouse of our body, of every cell, which transports the energy we need every second of our life in our cells. And when ATP is consumed, ADP is produced, and then AMP. And when the AMP content goes up, when we have used a lot of energy, AMPK is activated in order to build more ATP, more mitochondria, more powerhouses. The more mitochondria we have, the more energy we can produce for our body. This is basically the smallest unit of energy we know. We had a great interview with Professor Birkmeyer. He developed NADH in order to build ATP, and through this has been able to generate very positive effects with the patients, with our organism and our metabolism. But we can also apply the same principle through intermittent fasting. It also has an impact on gene expression, on the epigenome, by activating the sirtuins, the life mechanism, and AMPK. At the same time, intermittent fasting reduces oxidative stress. We know that oxidative stress can be a cause of chronic inflammations triggering cancer, but also Alzheimer's disease. Chronic inflammation is in constant interplay in a vicious circle with chronic stress, which basically means that our immune system is turned off, part of our brain cells are turned off. We also generate new brain cells through intermittent fasting, which makes it easier to think clearly. Intermittent fasting also reduces risk factors for cardiovascular diseases, heart diseases, killer number one, by reducing blood pressure, cholesterol level. It has an influence on triglycerides and inflammation markers. So you can see there's a large number of positive effects of intermittent fasting. Again, look at nature. Obviously, we did practice intermittent fasting. There were no supermarkets. There was no fridge. We always had to go and look for food first. We were always in a situation of scarcity. We were always craving for food. But it was a balanced diet of scarcity. We ate plants, leaves, fruit, which gave us access to a wealth of micronutrients. But there was always too little. There was no overweight tens of thousands of years ago. Let's now take a look at this chart again. I've shown this slide several times over before, but we can't show it often enough. When we work out and exercise, NAD goes up because ATP is formed. ATP is also used, the energy is used, and as a result we have more AMP in our body. This is what we can achieve with exercise and workout, but also with fasting, which means that fasting has a similar effect, a similarly positive effect to our organism than sports. The ideal would be to combine the two, fasting and exercise. This will intensively accelerate the whole mechanism. This is what happens on a biochemical level. NADH, which we'll come back to when we talk about breathing and oxidation. NADH plus oxygen causes a reduction to NAD plus, and NAD plus, as we can see to the right, will go up. This is where we are. The sirtuins will be activated. That's the survival mechanism. So sirtuins 1 to 7, they become activated, and we can see what happens in the green bar: regeneration, rejuvenation. This is a principle that works throughout the entire life. At the same time, more ATP is used because we don't eat, we don't add any food, which causes more AMP to be present, and AMP increases AMPK, the adenosine monophosphate protein kinase, which has an influence on all the positive factors down here. We can also achieve the same effect with a drug, but I won't recommend it because it has massive side effects. Diabetes patients take this drug. It's a drug which reduces hunger and activates AMPK. At the same time, as a result of fasting, fat is burned, proteins are consumed, glucose goes down, insulin goes down, growth hormones go down, insulin like growth factor 1 goes down. This is what you can see here, triggered at the top, and it all causes sirtuins and AMPK to become activated. mTOR and IIS will be inhibited. I'll come back to these abbreviations later on. All of these mechanisms cause a rejuvenation. Why? mTOR is inhibited. TOR is target of rapamycin. M stands for mechanical target of rapamycin. This reduces the proliferation of cancer cells and also inhibits metabolic derailment. It means prolongation of life. telomeres will be longer, and the formation of stem cells will be boosted as well. We also produce more mitochondria, and the effect is anti-proliferative as well, which means cancer is prevented. IIS is the acronym for insulin IGF-1 signaling pathway, and if we inhibit IIS, again we get an anti-proliferative effect. Proliferative means that cancer diseases are promoted. Of course, they become more paramount as we grow older. And it all boils down to the same thing. The only real disease we need to address is aging. If we address aging, if we prevent aging, we can treat all chronic diseases at the same time and don't have to look at individual diseases such as cardiovascular diseases, cancer, autoimmune diseases, diabetes, etc. Just by targeting aging, we can deal with everything else in one go. Professor Birkmeyer was able to show this very nicely when he was here in the interview, but also Professor David Sinclair from Harvard University. Let's now take a look at the different forms of nutrition compared to intermittent fasting. If we keep our proteins low, we inhibit mTOR, which is a good thing in the first place. If we keep proteins and carbohydrates low, we reduce the release of insulin, which is also a favorable effect. If we have a pure fat diet, what we do is inhibit mTOR, we reduce insulin, but we do not activate AMPK. But we want to activate AMPK because this will form new mitochondria and thus more ATP. A ketogenic diet could generate ATP through fat, but again, no AMPK will be formed, will not be activated, because if we generate ATP directly from fat, we have a lot of ATP compared to little AMP, which means AMPK will be inhibited rather than activated, but we want it to be activated in order to generate as many mitochondria, power cells in our powerhouses in our cell as possible, because that will in the end give us more ATP, and that's what it's all about. ATP means that we've got enough energy available, and many diseases can be broken down to a lack of energy. Only fasting can influence all nutrient sensors at the same time. The four mechanisms I just showed. Inhibition of mTOR, of IIS, activation of AMPK, activation of sirtuins. This can only be achieved through exercise and fasting. There is an influence also from cryotherapy, which we'll come back to at a later stage, but it's also influenced by the application of heat. So we can see just how important and effective intermittent fasting can be and how beneficial it is for our health. Right, now let's move on. We will continue to talk about the physical level. So far we've covered nutrition, food, 16 to 8 intermittent fasting. Next time we'll talk about exercise, but today we would like to continue with breathing. Let's take a closer look at what breathing is. We need to distinguish between external breathing, which basically means we inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. That's external breathing. And there's internal breathing as well. Cell breathing, I'm sure you will remember that from your biology class. There are 3 mechanisms I'd like to explain. We have glycolysis, the citrate cycle, and the breathing chain. The anaerobic glycolysis without oxygen, in other words, is basically a reaction which means obtaining energy which causes very fast performance but very little endurance. That's the anaerobic glycolysis, which generates lactic acid and fairly little ATP. This is why the aerobic glycolysis is much better in terms of output. Aerobic means there's oxygen present and there's two steps. The citrate cycle on the one hand, glucose will be completely transformed to CO2, carbon dioxide, and energy will be released in the form of electrons. And these electrons will bind to NAD+, turning it into NADH. And now we have NADH again, which we talked about with Professor Birkmeyer. He was the first one to actually stabilize this fairly volatile, unstable NADH and to actually integrate it into a supplement and administer it to people to ensure a higher level of NADH, because it can transgress the cell membrane. And NADH now transmits energy through the hydrogen molecules, and with oxygen being present, 15 times ATP is produced, plus water, plus NAD+. And NAD+, as we know, has an influence on the sirtuins and activates the sirtuins, our survival mechanism. So much on our breathing. Just to remind you of the basics, I'm sure most of you will have forgotten from biology class, because that's a while back already. Now let me talk about the Wim Hof method. Wim Hof is the Iceman. He holds 28 world records. He's achieved things that everybody thinks are impossible. And every medical expert will tell you it's impossible to stay in an ice bath for 2.5 hours, water at the temperature of 1 to 4 degrees centigrade. He also climbed Mount Everest barefoot in his shorts, and he survived a long time in this death zone. He was also scrutinized scientifically like almost no one else, just to make sure he doesn't play any tricks. His method is composed of 3 steps. Breathing technique. You breathe in 30 times in a forced manner. Abdominal breathing, chest breathing, and head breathing. That's the term Wim Hof uses. So we try not only to fill our tummy with air, but also our chest. And we imagine that we also fill our head with air, which basically we do, because we fill our respiratory tract, the maxillary sinus, the nasal cavity, the frontal sinus, and we do that 30 times. Then we stop breathing and try and hold our breath for as long as possible. Basically what we're doing here is hyperventilating, because we take in too much oxygen. So you've got to do this in a position where you are safe, when you're seated, and not when you're on the way, on the move, certainly not when you run, when you drive a car, or when you swim, because you might get a little bit dizzy as well. So stop breathing, hold your breath for as long as possible, and if you can't hold your breath any longer, breathe out briskly. Breathe in again and hold it for another 15 seconds. And after 15 seconds, you start again. And here's the interesting bit. When we do this in the morning, we'll find that we are in a very strong position. We are in very good shape. We have very little stress, which is usually the case in the morning, less so than at lunch or in the evening. So the less stress we have, the more basic we are, the more oxygen we have in our system, the better we are in regenerating. We will find easily that in the morning we can hold our breath for much longer than perhaps at lunchtime, where we'll be struggling, and in the evening it's even worse, particularly after a stressful day. So let's go through this cycle 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and you'll find that you will be able to hold your breath a little longer every time. I've been applying this method for 20 days now, and in the meantime I have reached a stage when I get up in the morning to hold my breath for up to 3 minutes after 4 or 5 cycles, because every time we take in more oxygen and we become basic. In parallel, and that's the second part of his method, is to increase the contact with a cold surface. You can do this by taking a cold shower. You can also have a bath, a cold bath. At Lake Constance, we get very cold water from the depth of Lake Constance. It's about 6 degrees centigrade. So every day you try and stay in the water for 5 seconds longer. I can currently handle an hour, 1 minute and 40 seconds. When you do it for the first time, you'll feel it's difficult. I usually just take a shower after working out for hygiene reasons, and I then turn off the hot water. I first start with my left leg, my right leg, the left arm, the right arm, working my way towards the heart, then the upper part of my body, the trunk, the head, and then I can sit down into the cold water. And I then have a stopwatch or a smartphone just to measure how long you can stick it out in the cold water. When you do this for the first time, you will feel pain, particularly in your legs, and it goes up exponentially. You jump out of the water after 15 seconds. But I can assure you, if you stick it out for longer, pain will either go down or at least not become stronger anymore. You have to get used to it, of course, first, and don't do it by yourself. It's always good to have someone next to you, and you can only do it in a healthy situation. You've got to have a strong heart. You will be breathing intensively, not hyperventilating, but you should have practiced the breathing exercise before the ice bath, and then you will see what happens. You can see that it's going to be very, very positive. The third part is about concentration exercises to do with discipline and mindset, some practice sessions there. Very nice meditation exercises by Wim Hof. Wim Hof's brain and body functions were measured in various studies at university. He had some neoprene overall equipped with sensors to find out what happens to his body and body temperature. And the result was that the surface temperature of his skin hardly changed at all when cold was applied. This was possible because the sympathetic component of his autonomous nervous system was increasingly innervated. And he was able to show that he is indeed able to control the autonomous nervous system. The autonomous nervous system is called autonomous because it's autonomous and cannot be controlled deliberately by us. But Wim Hof was able to show that with his method, it is possible to deliberately control the autonomous nervous system. It also emerged that there was a glucose combustion in the intercostal muscles, which meant that the body temperature the core temperature did not decrease. It was also measured that opioids and cannabinoids in the brain were released, and it makes much more sense, of course, that opioids are not derived from gluten particles or from milk or after having smoked an opium pipe, but that we produce them ourselves. We can also achieve this result by practicing endurance sport. This helps to release opioids, and we have the receptors for this, and if we produce it ourselves, there are no adverse effects, of course. The effect is analgesic, and it also reduces our sensitivity to pain. Here is a study that was performed on Wim Hof and those applying his method. There were two groups, a test group and a control group. The test group applied the Wim Hof method. Here you can see on this footage what they did. They exposed their bodies to cold, lying in the snow at 0 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes in the snow. And I always do this as well. After a cold application, I take a hot shower or go to the sauna to warm up the body, because otherwise we won't warm up again. They also hiked up a tree at very low temperatures, below zero. Then they practiced the meditation and breathing exercises, and they were then vaccinated with endotoxins from E. coli. And it emerged that with the test group, more adrenaline was released, activating the autonomous nervous system. The pro-inflammatory cytokines, TNF alpha or interleukin 6, which is fairly dangerous with regard to the cytokine storm and COVID-19, and interleukin 8, both of them were reduced, while the production of anti-inflammatory mediators, interleukin 10, was activated. Basically, this is the break of our immune system. So it was possible to show scientifically in various studies that Wim Hof's method actually works. By the way, the test group exposed to this method clearly developed fewer flu-like symptoms, as you can see on the slide. Okay, we are now going to practice ourselves now. This is the app that I highly recommend to you. It's free, you can just download it, and there is the breathing method that you can click on. We're now going to proceed as follows. We're going to breathe in and breathe out 30 times, forced breathing in, and then breathe out passively, which means we don't deliberately leave air in our lungs, but we don't press it out either, just to make sure there's a balance inside and outside. But by breathing in actively, we have more air available than we actually exhale. Once we've completed the 30 cycles of breathing in and breathing out, we wait for 2 minutes. If you can't hold your breath for 2 minutes, we'll do it twice. Just exhale before, take a deep breath again, and then hold it again for 15 seconds. You've got to measure the time by yourself, and then just start breathing normally again and wait for everyone else to finish until we start again. So let's get started. Now you all start breathing in and out. Make sure you breathe in properly. Fill the whole tummy, fill the whole chest. Fill your head as well, maxillary sinus, frontal sinus, fill it all up with air. Then breathe out in a relaxed way. Make sure you're seated or lying down. Don't perform the exercise while standing. All right, 7 more to go. And once we've completed the 30 cycles, don't breathe in too much, don't exhale too much, just hold it somewhere in the middle and hold your breath. Hold it for as long as possible. Don't torture yourself. Right, and now just relax, don't move. Try and hold your breath. If possible, we hold our breath for 2 minutes. If you can't hold it for that long, don't torture yourself. Just breathe out before, take another deep breath and hold the breath again for 15 seconds. Do the count in your head and wait for the second round. All right, for those of you who have been able to stick it out for so long, we have now reached 2 minutes and we stop the app. So take a deep breath now, hold your breath for 15 seconds. If you've already completed the 15 seconds before, just continue breathing normally and wait for everyone else. Breathe out, and now we start the cycles again. Second round. And again, we make sure we fill our tummy, our chest, our head. And then we breathe out in a relaxed manner, without an overpressure, without an underpressure in our lungs, just a normal way of breathing out. Make sure there is a balance. And again, 30 cycles. We repeat exactly what we did before. Depending on how long you were able to hold your breath last time, you will notice that you will go beyond what you managed before. If you just managed 1 minute and 15 seconds before, you may be able to manage 1 minute and 30 seconds, perhaps even 45. Right, we are about to complete the second round. We will then hold our breath again. Don't fill your lungs completely, don't empty them completely, just keep it somewhere in the middle. And hold it. Try not to move too much, switch off your brain completely, just sit there and relax. All right, I think 2 rounds is enough for now. What you most likely have been able to observe is that the second time round you were able to hold your breath a little longer than the first time round, and this is an effect which is going to increase every single time you do it. When I was stressed one day, I may take 3, 4 or even 5 rounds until I manage the 3 minutes. It depends on what my status is. Every time I work my way up to the 2.5, 3 minutes and measure my heart rate variability, I find that I have reached a highly regenerated state again. Since I've been applying this method, I've been able to reduce my biological age. Again, I was able to reduce it down to 25.2 methods. This goes to show how powerful this method is. Of course, I don't need the app. I can do it without the app. Taking a cold shower doesn't cost anything. If I don't use any warm water, I don't use any energy, and I don't need anything for breathing. Oxygen comes for free. So it's a great method that we can apply anywhere, anytime. If I were to feel stressed during the day, I would make sure that in my lunch break I practice long enough to reach the 2 minutes again, the same in the evening, 2, 3 or even 5 rounds until I manage the 2 minutes, and then I can be assured that I'll have a very good night. Here's a slide with a book by Dr. Shioya. I read it 10 years ago. He was the personal doctor of the Japanese emperor, and he wrote this book in 2003. He is one of the longest living humans ever. He was 105 years old. You can check him out on Wikipedia. He's one of the 20 or 30 people who have lived the longest, and he's one of the most prominent figures in this group. He wrote this book in 2003. He died in 2008, but he wrote the book at the age of 100. He focuses strongly on breathing. His medical approach during his professional career all boiled down to breathing exercises. So it's a very, very interesting book. In the preface of his book, he writes that he used to be a frail person, a weak person, vulnerable, and his health only stabilized in his 90s. So for everyone watching this who is below 90, there is hope. He actually started taking up golf at the age of 100. And this is precisely what this is all about. If we lose a couple of months due to COVID-19 and the corona pandemic, so what? We'll get it back simply by reducing our biological age. The advantage is if we live longer, we can enjoy our children and grandchildren longer. Right, let's move on to the next chapter. I'd like to talk about the emotional level now. Here we will focus on stress. This is an issue we already talked about it last time. I will go through it fairly quickly, but we will look at stress in a systematic fashion. Let's address this question first. What is stress? Well, the saying goes that there is good stress and bad stress, positive and negative stress, but even the good stress, also called eustress, isn't good because adrenaline is released and stress mechanisms are triggered. It just feels better because of serotonin being released. Whereas with distress, cortisol is released as well as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Serotonin just makes us feel great. With distress, with negative stress, based on adrenaline, noradrenaline and cortisol, is not good for us. If we think back what happened thousands of years ago, the reason for distress might have been a lion or a saber-toothed tiger, natural disasters or enemies triggering stress. And this activated the autonomous nervous system, which we usually cannot influence, but with the Wim Hof method, as we've just seen, we can. So the autonomous nervous system has to respond quickly. And when we were in the cave, on a rock, or up in a tree on the other side of the river, we were safe again. So the fight, flight, hide mode set in. And the parasympathetic nervous system based on acetylcholine was activated. And as a result of this, we were then able to get out of the stressful situation again. What happens during a flight, hide, fight mode? Well, the skeletal muscles in charge of strengthening us in fight and flight, oxygen and nutrients are built up, blood pressure increases, the heart rate goes up, vascular constriction takes place, faster breathing, the release of fatty acids from fat deposits and glucose from the glycogen storage. The resting organs are inhibited. It makes no sense to digest anything or to produce antibodies, for example, because it just costs a lot of energy. For a few seconds, minutes, hours, it's just about survival. So everything which is not necessary is turned off. We can also imagine what happens when we turn off the healing mechanism, the immune system. This might be good for the fight, flight, hide mode if it's just over a few minutes, hours, or perhaps a few days, but it makes no sense to have this system operational over months or even years, which is usually the case with many of us. Core body temperature goes up, sweat is present in order to cool us down, but also to make us slippery to be able to escape in a fight. Pupils dilate at least by 10%. So if you see somebody with widely dilated pupils, it's a person under stress. Constricted pupils means that somebody has the parasympathetic nervous system activated. The kidney retains water, salivary glands are inhibited, and sexual organs are inhibited as well. So everything we don't need, everything that costs energy is inhibited, which is nice and well, but it's not good if it happens 24/7 over weeks and months. We can measure this, and we talked about this in the first part of the longevity code. We can look at heart rate variability to see what happens. Take a look at this red zone here. We can see the degree to which regeneration goes down and stress goes up, how intensive the breathing is. That's a typical stress reaction which happened there as a result of an infection with a flu virus 2 years ago. So this created stress in the organism. You can also use other measuring devices. Here's a device called BioMotion, produced by a startup company from Switzerland, here from Zurich. But you can also measure it with the Oura Ring, which can particularly measure the deep sleep phase as well as heart rate at rest, regeneration, and heart rate variability. We can easily see here with this information how well regenerated we are in the morning. If we are under constant stress, what is the result? Well, constant stress means we are always in an emergency mode. In the long run, this creates a lack of oxygen and an hyperacidification of the cells, which causes cell and tissue damage, and in the long run, even cancer. We can easily imagine what the Wim Hof method can do. This is why I presented this to you first. We have to make sure we get back into a basic state. You can easily measure this. Buy one of these pH strips in the pharmacy, get up in the morning and measure your pH value. You can either measure your urine, but you can also measure your saliva, and you will see that when you get up, it's all acid. And if you apply the Wim Hof method, you'll get back into the basic state again for the next 3 or 4 hours. What happens if you're exposed to constant stress? Well, it's a regulatory disorder. To the very right, you can see a structural disorder. This would be, for example, a liver damage, where we have an anatomic damage damage to the very tissue of the organ. It all started very small with a disorder, a regulatory disorder, and if a regulatory disorder is sustained over weeks and months and years, it will cause a functional disorder, which means the liver won't work anymore, won't work properly anymore. And if this situation persists, you can see a tissue damage. It all starts very, very small with regulatory damages, grows through functional damage and develops into tissue damage, structural damage. So we've got to attack this early on. In the long run, the immune system and healing mechanisms are turned off. So people exposed to constant stress will fall ill immediately when they go on holidays because the parasympathetic nervous system sets in and they fall ill. Take a look at what students experience during final exams. They may not be ill during the exams. They are under the influence of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. If the exam goes well, there might even be serotonin and eustress, but the immune system and the healing system has been turned off. Despite a lack of sleep and unhealthy food, the candidate may not fall ill, but after the final exam, when the parasympathetic mode sets in and acetylcholine comes in, then the immune system is activated again, and that's why everyone falls ill after final exams. During such time, we have no regeneration, no healing. So let's look at the different types of stress we have. On the one hand, there is real stress, physical stress. So if somebody were to attack us with a weapon, this would really be a dangerous situation. And fortunately, this is no longer the case today very often. There is other forms of physical stress triggered, for example, by metals, which are becoming ever more important in our lives. Heavy metals, particularly mercury, the most toxic non-radioactive element on Earth, but also toxins have a negative impact coming from inflammatory processes in our bodies, endotoxins, but also toxins released by endodontically treated teeth, for example, but toxins we take up with food, particularly if we eat something at the end of the food chain, glyphosate, dioxins, but also allergens with gluten. But overweight is also a stress factor for our body. Deficiencies are a problem. Deficiency in terms of magnesium or vitamin D3. Lack of fitness is a cause of stress for our body. We'll talk about this later. The role of sports and physical exercise. We will also talk about how important it is to have a very strong basic fitness to make sure that everything we do, we can do with ease. I keep saying in my courses that all of us have to strive for physical fitness comparable to an athlete. If we have to go to an operating theatre and perform surgery, we shouldn't have any back pain, not after 2, 3 or even 8 hours. This is the only way to really show top performance. No matter what you want to learn, if you want to take up a new sport, and if you have a very good basic fitness, you will be able to learn this new sport much more quickly. And bad food also has an important role to play here, because it creates stress for our body, lack of sleep equally so, and electromagnetic fields obviously influence our physical stress, because cell stress and the activation of cytokine and interleukin 6 is obvious with radiation, which is why we have to try and avoid electromagnetic fields. So much for physical stress. Let's move on to psychological stress. This is an artificial form of stress. It's not real. It's the result of fear or anxiety during the corona crisis, for example, but also the result of images in our mind, in our brains. You can see from the photographs here that these people are experiencing psychological stress due to the images they are seeing. This is what we've got to avoid. So all the images or films you get sent via WhatsApp or email, just look at the positive ones. Anything that could trigger anxiety or fear goes to the recycle bin in my case. And I move on to the next point on my agenda because I'm simply convinced that it makes perfect sense to work without fear. Everyone who is a serious practitioner works without fear. You can't use fear as a method to make us healthy, to motivate us for whatever. It is only beneficial to our organism if it's without stress. And then there's emotional stress as well, which is based on feelings. Now, obviously, relationships are a main source, the biggest source for stress on the emotional level. Position number 2 is our job, mobbing or bullying. And then number 3, we have certain situations or places. For example, a traffic jam can easily trigger a stressful situation. Let us now talk about how to avoid stress. Let's look at the mechanisms again and think about how to avoid them. The real stress, the physical stress, if somebody threatens us with a weapon, can only be avoided by avoiding such situations in the first place, because such situations cannot be controlled. Somebody who performs free climbing usually knows what he or she does, and such dangerous situations don't trigger any stress because the person knows what she is doing, what he is doing. But if we expose ourselves deliberately to dangerous situations, it's different. You might always die if you expose yourself to danger. And this is the kind of stress we definitely try to avoid. If we look at the second level, physical stress, then it's obvious that we need to avoid all of these bullet points here. We need to make sure that we do not ingest any heavy metals from amalgam fillings, for example. We need to make sure we eat healthy food, we exercise properly, we are in good shape and sleep well. And we also need to avoid EMF wherever we can. So let's turn off our smartphone as often as possible. Let's make sure we turn off the power of our wireless LAN infrastructure, or even use a canopy, a radiation protection canopy, just to make sure that we can guarantee high quality sleep. Let us now talk about psychological stress. I mentioned before that this is all due to images in our mind. Here's a nice quote I'd like to show you. I experienced many catastrophes or disasters in my life, most of which never materialized. This is what Mark Twain said. And this is exactly what this is all about. We often worry endlessly about things that never really ever materialize. 99% of these fears will never materialize, but they're still there, and there's an easy way of handling such cases. This is an exercise we're not going to do now, but I'd like to ask you to do it over the weekend, which is why the online seminar is taking place on a Friday. Usually we do it right in the course. So I'm going to ask you to write down your worst case scenario. What is the main cause of stress? What are you most afraid of? For example, of falling ill, catching a coronavirus, going bankrupt, your company being destroyed. So please describe this worst case scenario. What is most stressful for you? What are you most afraid of? You can write it down on a sheet of paper and then think about a worst case escape plan. So you will say, okay, if this worst case were to materialize, if I were to develop cancer, what would happen? If I were to go bankrupt due to COVID-19, what would happen? How would I handle this situation? And as soon as you've put this down in writing, as soon as you have the solutions on the page, you will see that this psychological burden, this fear, will vanish into thin air because you have a worst case escape plan. It's always great to assume that the world is perfect, but you've got to be prepared for a worst case. And what is happening at the moment is something which I already anticipated as a worst case scenario a while back. Over the last 20 years, basically starting in the year 2000 when the bubble burst for the first time, and again in 2008 and 2009, we kept working on worst case scenarios. We adapted them regularly to make sure how we could handle a complete collapse of the economy. together with the colleagues in my company, and particularly last summer, we realized that it won't take long for yet another collapse. I would have expected it to happen next year, but we were prepared. We already had a detailed plan as to how to handle the situation when this happens. When we realized in the middle of March it is going to happen now, all we needed to do is to look at the different chapters and implement the plans we had developed before. We were one of the first companies in Switzerland applying with the government for short-time work and to apply for bridging loans. We also talked to our landlords in order to stabilize our situation very quickly. So we had no fears, no anxiety, not just before the crisis, but also during the crisis, because we knew we will always survive the worst case. We had a worst case escape plan. And when the worst case materialized, it didn't make me nervous at all. Our team didn't panic. We just looked at the different chapters we had developed and said, this is what we'll have to do. And I immediately had capacity available in my mind and with my energy to manage the situation. It would have been impossible to start Swiss BioHealth News immediately if we hadn't been prepared, because this took up 4 hours every day. If we hadn't done our homework before, this would not have been possible. But we were ahead, 2 weeks ahead of everyone else, and we were able to say immediately, right, what do we need to do now in order to keep everything going, to keep everything alive? And it was obvious that we wanted to do something for you, our friends, our patients, our clients. We wanted to provide solutions to you as to how to handle the situation, because this is absolutely important. We need to be able to keep in contact with our stakeholders, our friends, our clients, and our colleagues, particularly in this case, because there is also a certain degree of isolation which simply had to take place. Now, we had described everything in detail before, so we were able to respond very quickly. At one point, some members of the team thought, well, Volz is out of his mind. He is overreacting completely. But just a couple of days into the crisis, everybody realized, well, this was well prepared and well implemented. And at no point did we experience stress. I explained this in the first part of the longevity code already. You were able to see my heart rate variability over the period of time in question, and it was as high as it has always been in the years before. Actually, over the past 2 to 3 weeks, the values were even better, but I was always above 100% in terms of regeneration and stress at zero, simply because we're using the time now to look after our health even more. I mentioned it in the first part very clearly when we started. I said, now we're going to step up the game, invest in energy, invest in health, invest in regeneration, and invest in healthy food. So work out the plan before to get rid of the stress. And if this worst case scenario actually materializes, you already have a solution. So describe it to the very detail. Let's now talk about emotional stress, job, relationships, places, situations. How can we get prepared? Well, with emotional stress, this is the principle we need to apply. Emotion comes from motion. Do something. Don't remain still. Take action. You may have to change something. If you have a problem in a relationship, you either have to improve the relationship again or end the relationship. The same is true for your profession, for example, or your job. If you don't change anything, if you just go into hide mode, if you freeze more or less and just stay where you are and try and bear an unbearable situation in your profession or in a relationship, you will develop what we call a safe problem. That's Anthony Robbins' terminology. If we don't do anything, if we do not take action, we develop a safe problem. Taking action is always risky. If you leave a situation, leave a relationship, or leave a job, you need a risky decision. And very often we're afraid of doing so, and as a result don't do anything. This is another decision, just not to do anything, and we then just develop a safe problem. This may be a disease or a form of depression as well. So it's very important to do something. Do not ruminate. Do not think things over and over again. Emotion comes from motion. You've got to move things. If emotional stress is imminent, you've got to get moving. Don't remain still. Get out. Take a walk, even for several hours if that's necessary. You will have the right ideas and your emotional status will be improved. Negative emotions and negative feelings materialize every time we don't take action, but simply freeze and don't do anything. I keep saying, in difficult situations, you shouldn't try and be annoyed at yourself. That's what we say. I'm annoyed at myself, but it doesn't make sense. There's no point in annoying oneself, because then I only have the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol in my own body. What's important is to annoy others. I don't mean that literally. I mean it without any emotion. And I would like to use an image from Alexander Neubauer, who also gives courses here at the Educational Center. Take the monkey back to where it belongs. Very often somebody puts a monkey on our shoulder, and then we've got to deal with it. We've got to identify such situations. Somebody is passing a problem on to us, puts a monkey on our shoulder. Let's take the monkey and put it back to where it came from. So whenever we have a problem, we've got to give it back. Or if we need to solve a problem, it would make sense to make it the problem of your opposite number. Let me give you an example. During this corona crisis, if we are not able to pay the rent, we've got to talk to our landlords and share the problem. Make our problem his problem. If we weren't able to pay the rent and would have to move out, it would be very hard for the landlord to find new tenants for these premises. So you can talk to your landlord, make your problem his problem as well, and surely the landlord is going to help you, for example, by deferring the deadline for the payment of the rent, because the landlord also has an interest in you doing well. Being annoyed doesn't really make sense. It's being angry is like holding a piece of live coal or burning coal in your hand and hoping that the other person feels the pain. This is a fallacy. It won't work. But something does help to prevent and deal with emotional stress. Metaphors. Metaphors can develop a very strong form of energy. If you can't change your situation, change your attitude. We'll talk about this in the third part of the longevity code. We will be talking about framing, what is around a situation. And if we cannot change the situation per se, as is the case with Corona, we can simply accept that it's there. This was the second statement I made in the first part of the longevity code. We said, okay, as of now, the crisis mode, the corona crisis, is the new normal. We adjust the desired state. We put the desired state at a lower level. This is the current situation. The corona situation means that we will not achieve the desired status. We've got to adjust the desired status and say the corona crisis is the new normal. We simply changed our attitude, our mindset vis-a-vis the crisis, and simply accept without questioning it that this is the new situation. Another important quote is the following: "The dogs are barking, but the caravan moves on." Many times in my life I have been attacked because I did things differently from others. I was the first one to say don't use amalgam. I was also the first one to push for ceramic inlays and ceramic implants. At the beginning of each development I was attacked intensively. I decided not to respond. I just said, well, the dogs are barking, but the caravan moves on. And here's another one you may be aware of: only the strong will survive. Or if they are too strong, you are too weak. This is another phrase that I think applies very often. And this is what I try to apply to our environment. It's important to strengthen our immune system. If COVID-19 is too strong, we are too weak. So we've got to strengthen our immune system to be able to handle all the viruses that will confront us over the next few years. This will be the new normal. These viruses that will attack us is the new normal. They've always been there, but it's become very important now. We have become aware of it now. We don't have enough vitamin D3, not enough vitamin C, so suddenly these viruses can attack us. If it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. That's another one. Or stand up and deliver. That's another statement from the seminars given by Anthony Robbins. We can just say, well, let's get there and get it over with, get it done. If I need to give a speech, I go up to the stage and without any further ado, deliver my presentation. There's no point mulling it over time and time again. Last time, when we talked about emotions and the factors generating emotions, we looked at the triad and we mentioned this quote, never ever do anything without being in a peak state. Here we've got the triad made up of posture, breathing, language, transformational vocabulary, but also images. This is what we need to generate any feeling. Take a look at the longevity code part 1 to find out how to create any form of emotion and get out of the emotional stress. Let me repeat, we are not at the mercy of the feelings, but we can actively go to the emotions through the triad and generate those emotions ourselves. This is the principle by Lothar Seibert, the time guru, who says, if you're in a hurry, slow down. Take your time to tell our brain that we've got enough time. So this is another way of influencing the way we think through the triad. This brings us on to the last part of my second part here. We're almost up to 2 hours now. In this last part, I'd like to talk about the 80-20 principle, the Pareto law or the Pareto rule. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And here's what it says. 20% of effort will generate 80% of the return of the success. If you're a marathon runner, you know what I'm talking about. It will be fairly easy to obtain a finishing time of 3 hours and 45 minutes. But if you want to get down to 3 hours, you need to practice and train much, much more. And if you want to improve from 3 hours to 2 hours, you need endless amounts of training. So with 20% of effort, we can obtain 80% of the output of the final result. But for the remaining 20%, we need to invest an exorbitant amount of effort. I'm not quite sure whether this is a recommendation or a warning, perhaps. Pareto telling us, guys, if you really want to be good, you've got to be aware that the remaining 20% come at a very high price and will require a great deal of energy. Edison put it nicely, 1% inspiration, 99% transpiration. What does it mean for us? Well, we shouldn't try to work on our weaknesses. What we should be doing is strengthening our strengths, because it would just require too much of an effort to eliminate all the weaknesses. It makes much more sense to work on our strengths, to double our strengths. If I use 20% twice with my strengths, I've already achieved 160% of my success. So always look at what my strengths are and how we can strengthen them further or double them in order to obtain a maximum result and become a specialist in strengthening the strengths. That's it for the Pareto law. Let me talk about the Parkinson principle now in closing. This has got nothing to do with Parkinson's disease, but it is a principle developed by a gentleman called Parkinson. And this is what he found. This is what he said. He said, work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. What does it mean? Well, particularly dentists among you will know you usually intuitively determine how much time you require for a particular treatment with a patient. If you need to prepare teeth, if you need an imprint, etc., let's go for 2.5 hours, and then you check your watch and 2.5 hours will have elapsed. If you would have said, well, let's do it open end, that's not advisable. Open end is probably the most stupid way of planning a particular activity, but also for meetings. You've always got to limit meetings because usually you won't get anywhere. Now, unless, of course, your plan is completely unrealistic. But what you need to do is to define, to limit, and to focus. So we define a particular activity, and this is the way I do it currently. My intention is not to go online before 4 p.m. I read no emails, I answer no WhatsApp messages, no Trello, no Slack. Until 4 p.m. the time is mine and my project's time. This is when I am creative, when I am productive rather than busy, or active rather than reactive. And then I give myself 1 hour. And I limit it because otherwise I will work until 11 p.m. So I limit myself, and I don't want to be online all the time. I go offline immediately. We talked about the morning routine before. The morning routine being extremely important, and we've got to try not to use our smartphones for as long as we can. So my plan is to work on emails from 4 to 5 p.m. I address all the issues presented to me, and at 5 p.m. I put the smartphone away. I simply stop and don't use it anymore because I know it is limited. I keep myself to the minimum. I answer my emails. I limit 4 to 5 p.m. and then I focus. What does this mean? I go online at 4 p.m. I receive all the messages and then I go offline again. Now, luckily, for 2 years, Siri has been operational in an offline mode as well, so I can dictate all my emails and WhatsApp messages also in a radiation-free offline mode. And at 5 p.m. I send out all the messages and turn the smartphone off immediately and only look at my inbox again the next day. If I were to remain online, I would constantly be bombarded with new messages, responses to my answers, etc. And it would simply undermine my concentration. We know today that multitasking is completely useless. It's too much of a distraction. It usually takes 23 minutes on average, according to scientific studies, before we get back to the original level of concentration that we were before the distraction happened. So 100% distraction, and complete the task. Don't do anything aside. Just focus on what you want to do. Just try it out for yourself. You know more or less how much time you need to invest in your emails and WhatsApp messages. Make sure today or tomorrow you just give yourself a certain time window. You can also put it in your calendar, 4 to 5 p.m. and you stop at 5 p.m. Then your entire system will be working towards making sure it can be handled fast and doesn't linger. Now, of course, maybe someone might be sending you a YouTube film, you click on it and find it interesting, but don't watch it now. Save it for later. You may want to look at it later on, together with your family perhaps, but certainly not now, because you only have 1 hour to address all your emails, to answer all your emails. And because you just have this 1 hour, you are extremely efficient and you manage to deal with all the messages. If you don't have a clear plan, if you say, well, this is my office day, you go to the office and start at 8 a.m. and look at what happens and then answer this email, and then the next email arrives and you answer this one, and then you get a response to the original message. Somebody sends a YouTube link, you watch the video, you've lost another half an hour, then you get a WhatsApp message and yet another one, and responses to your earlier emails, etc., etc. And at 5 p.m. you look at your plan and you will have to say, well, I didn't actually achieve anything actively, reactively. I was just busy responding to someone else's messages during the day. you can do exactly the same amount of work in 1 hour. You may not have responded to all of the messages, but you have been very active for the other 7 hours because everything was turned off. Your email, your smartphone, everything was turned off, and you were highly creative during the previous 7 hours. Now you go online for 1 hour, you work off the most important stuff, you limit yourself, you focus, go offline and look after your family. At the end of the day, when you're about to die, statistically speaking, it is highly unlikely that you will have a lot of time to reflect. Usually, death comes very quickly. Luckily or unfortunately, I don't know. My father died in January at the age of 96. Luckily for him, he had a lot of time before he passed away. Over 2 weeks, we were next to him every day, and he was one of the very few lucky ones who had time to reflect on his life. But symbolically speaking, if we're about to die and think about what was relevant in our life, we will never say, if only I had been on Instagram or WhatsApp more, if only I had written more emails, if only I had done this or that in the digital world. Most definitely not. What you will say is, if only I had spent more time on holidays, if only I had spent more time with my family, if only I had laughed more, if only I had enjoyed my life more, if only I had looked after my health more. Those are the thoughts that will go through our mind if ever we get the opportunity to reflect in the closing minutes or hours of our lives. This brings me to the end of the second part of the longevity code. Let me whet your appetite a little bit as to the other parts that I have in store for you. I don't know how many it will be, 3 or 4, until we're completely through with all the topics I'd like to cover. But next time we will be talking about sports and exercise. That's definitely an important issue. We will be talking about micronutrients as well. I'll be talking about the Fantastic Four and more. I'll be talking about various minerals and vitamins simply because they are extremely vital as a fuel, as a driver for our energy and health. On the emotional level, we'll talk about Human Needs Psychology by Anthony Robbins, where we get a 100% safe approach to identifying the way human beings behave. Why do people behave a certain way? Why do they not behave in a different way? We can also anticipate what people will do. Anthony Robbins has developed a complete set of psychological considerations, the human needs psychology. We will also be talking about how to stop patterns, and we will talk about framing on the emotional level. It's actually part of psychology as well. We will also talk about effectiveness. We will talk about the disease to please. Many of us find it hard to say no, but it's absolutely vital to be able to say no. It's an important quality. I'll talk about it. I'll talk about NIPSILT, not to think in terms of problems, but in terms of solution. I'll talk about class 1 to 4 activities, urgent ones and important ones but not urgent ones, urgent ones, not important ones, and not urgent and not important ones, etc., to prioritize your categories, your different tasks. And then we'll also be talking about time management and certain principles of work. These are very thrilling topics I'd like to talk about. I hope you enjoyed it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having watched this film. I gave you a bit of homework, the worst case scenario, to develop the worst case scenario. Do this over the weekend. This would be for next time. Thank you very much again for your kind attention. It was a great pleasure to deliver this presentation to you, and we will keep you updated through our newsletter, or if you subscribe to our newsletter, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you will automatically be informed when the next part of the Longevity Code will be online. Longevity Code Part 3. Thank you very much, and do have a very good evening.